Extracellular components are going to be components that we find outside the plasma membrane. And so they're somewhat outside the cell, and depending on the cell type that we're looking at, we're going to have different extracellular components listed there. So if we look at these two cells here, we have an example of an animal cell, and we also have the plant cell. And as far as the plasma membrane goes, that's the black line. So this would be the plasma membrane. And then notice in both cases, you have something that's located just outside of that. If we're talking about the animal cell, the structure that you see on the outside here, this is what we refer to as the extracellular matrix. And if we look over here at the plant cell, you can see that it has something different on the outside. And in the plant cell, that's going to be the cell wall. Okay, and so the cell wall is shown in purple. So let's take a look at each one of these separately. We'll talk about what type of molecules compose it, and then what role it's going to play for the overall cell. If we look at the animal cell, we've got the extracellular matrix. This is going to surround pretty much all animal cells. As far as the type of molecule that this is made of, it is going to be glycoproteins. And when we refer to glycoproteins, what that's really saying is that we've got proteins with sugars attached to them, and this is going to form really a fibrous network around the cell. Now, an important characteristic of this extracellular matrix is that this is going to be a flexible coating that's found around the cell. And this is important because the fact that it's flexible is going to allow the cell to still change shape. So the cell can change shape, which means that the cell is still going to be able to work properly in order for the animal to move. And that is an important characteristic of animals, that they do move around, so they need their cells to actually be flexible. If we look at the overall roles that the extracellular matrix is going to play for the animal cell, or in other words, if we look at the functions of the extracellular matrix, one of the primary roles is going to be that this is going to serve a protective function. And so protective because, again, it's an extra coating around the outside of the cell. It is going to give extra support to the cell. It is going to function also in regulation of really entry and exit somewhat, because anything that enters the cytoplasm would have to pass through this before it ever gets to the plasma membrane. And then another thing that it's going to do is it's going to help with movement of the cells. Some of this has to do with the fact that it is going to help them to change shape. And again, the changing of shape is important for movement. And then one last role that we want to list here is that this is important for attachment. And with attachment, we're talking about one cell attaching to another animal cell. Parts of their extracellular matrix can reach out and attach to each other, and that's going to kind of hold those different cells in place. In plant cells, it's going to be the cell wall that's found on the outside of the plasma membrane. And the cell wall is made of a different material than the extracellular matrix. In this case, it's going to be made of cellulose, and cellulose is actually a polysaccharide. But this is a structural polysaccharide, and as such, it's going to be very rigid. So it's a rigid structure that's found around the outside of a plant cell, and this is fine for plants because plants in general don't move around. So this rigid structure that we're finding around plant cells, it does have a lot of functions. Some of those functions are similar to what we find with the extracellular matrix. Some of them are a little bit different. It is going to provide a protective function, even more so than the extracellular matrix, because this is, again, a very rigid structure. It's like having a firm box around the outside of the cell. We can say that it is for helping to maintain cell shape. Generally speaking, when we're talking about plant cells, they're going to be fairly boxy in appearance. If we talk about other roles that this is going to play, this is important for preventing the plant cell from absorbing too much water. This is really important because if a plant cell absorbs too much water, what's going to happen is it actually is going to rupture, it's going to burst. So that would be a deadly thing for a plant cell. And so this cell wall is going to form this rigid box around the cell. And so while the plasma membrane is going to stretch when water enters, it's not going to be able to stretch beyond the confines of this box. So the cell wall around the plant cells, it is going to be a major distinguishing characteristic when we're looking at cells in a microscope. If we see a cell wall there, we know that we're definitely not looking at an animal cell. If we see a cell wall, it's probably a plant cell. I will say, though, that there are some other cell types that do have cell walls around them. And examples of that would be fungi. Fungi cells do have a cell wall, but it's going to be made of a different material. It won't be made of cellulose. And then we also find cell walls around bacterial cells.